Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century has generated major debates around the globe on inequality and the dynamics behind the changes in inequality and economic growth over time. And Professor Piketty has agreed to do a short interview for H France, which will allow him to respond to the reviews of his work that will be appearing online for H France. But it also gives us a chance to talk with him in order to introduce him to H France readers and to have some brief discussion of both the success of his book and the impact that it's had so far, and the importance that he sees for having better and more historical research in order to understand the nature and the dynamics of changes in inequality over time. So Thomas, I'm very glad that you were able to meet with us briefly in your busy schedule. We are interviewing at his home institution, which is the Paris School of Economics. And I would like to start off by asking you about the success that Capital in the 21st Century has had so far. You've just told me it's now being translated into 39 languages. Its global sales, I think, passed 1.5 million in December of last year. So it's clearly not only provided a quality and a depth of research that is really impressive, but it's also responded to a need in some much larger sense than just a historical community in terms of the kind of analysis that it gives for inequality over time and the importance of dealing with inequality as a public policy issue. So I have a couple of initial questions for you. One of them is, who did you see as the critical audiences for your book when you wrote it, and has that changed with the success that the book has had?
Well, I tried to write a book for a broad international audience, certainly not for specialized economists or historians. What I had in mind is an audience that, has enough time and energy to enter into a big book, of course, but the book, I think, is readable by almost anyone, and I try to make it very accessible. So, of course, I could not expect that it would work so well, and 1.5 million copies is definitely more than anything I could possibly expect. But at the same time, I really tried hard to make it a readable book from the beginning. And I guess the success of the book shows that there is a strong demand for, I would say, more democratization of economic and social and historical knowledge and research. And there are many people who want to make their own opinion about these important issues about income and wealth and capital and the public debt and growth rate and rate of return. These are not technical issues, and I guess too often they are presented as very technical issues, and the success of the book shows that there are many people who don't want to leave these issues to a small group of specialists or experts and want to make their own opinion. So I'm very glad, of course, about the success.
And do you think that it's been getting the right response from the people that you most wanted to reach?
Well, I want to reach normal people, so I don't know the reaction of most normal people who read it, but I meet lots of people everywhere when I go to Korea or Brazil or China or Argentina or Turkey or Spain, and I meet lots of people who tell me that they don't usually read that kind of book and that they understood everything, and this makes me very happy. Now, it takes time for people to read the book, so the more academic debates in a way are only starting, because it takes time to read the book and to write reviews, such as the very nice reviews that were written for this symposium, and I'm looking forward for the debate to continue.
Good. Can I ask you, because it has been a point of at least remark, if not debate, the title for the book, Capital in the 21st Century, must have taken some thought on your part as to how you wanted to title the book. It is not titled The History of Inequality and Economic Growth Since the 18th Century. It's titled Capital in the 21st Century, which is not, at first glance, a historical title that is going to draw historians, but the title, did you have particular reasons for framing it in that way?
Oh yes, of course. I think this is the right title. I think the reason I picked this title is because I'm trying to put the study of the distribution and of the long run back at the center of economic analysis and political economy, which was the case to some extent in the 19th century with many economists from very different political or economic persuasion, from Ricardo to Marx and others, were putting the issue of the distribution at the center of the analysis. So I'm trying to, in a way, I'm trying to pursue this tradition, but of course with a lot more data, historical evidence. So I try to put the study of capital into the 21st century, which to me means first to treat it as an historical object. So in the 21st century means that the structure of capital is not the same today in the 19th century, 20th century. So I try to take it as a subject of historical inquiry, which has not been the case as much as it should, I think, until recently. And also it's capital in the 21st century because this is the age of big data, or at least where it's possible to collect data at a scale that was not possible before. And a lot of my merit, if any, comes from the fact that new information technologies make it much easier to collect data than at the time of Marx, of course, but even at the time of Kennneth, or even until the 1980s or 1990s, to a large extent, it was much more difficult to do the kind of broad historical comparative international data collection project that we can do today. Also, a big difference with the new information technology is that we can put all the technical stuff online so that we can focus on telling a story. And I think that's also the big difference with some of the serial history traditions that we had, in particular in France, until the 70s or 80s, where people were putting so much energy at collecting their data that sometimes their book looked a little bit like a big statistical appendix. And so and they did not focus so much on the historical interpretation and the political history and the broader social and cultural historical dimension. Whereas with the modern technology, you can put everything online and the statistical material online and focus really on the interpretation. So this is capital in the 21st century in the sense, this is an age where, in a way, we have more opportunities for doing that kind of research.
And what is possible to know now that it wasn't before.
Yes, so that's what I meant with this title.
Yeah, which I was going to comment, and you brought it up that all your data is available online, and so rather than it being an added weight to the book, which is a substantial volume, it's there for people who want to go and see it. For those who are not interested in the numbers but in the argument, they have your explanation in the book that does proceed on a very careful, step-by-step basis to construct a large argument. I want to ask you then about your responses to the reviewers. Now, normally in an H France forum, there would be a written response by the author, and rather than having that written response, we're doing this interview, which I think rather than focusing on specific content in specific reviews, I'll ask you a few questions about some of the things that show up in the different reviews. First of all of them obviously recognize that this is a really major work and that it's important not only for historians to know about it and appreciate what's there, but for a much broader public as well. One of the things that shows up as a point where reviewers would have liked more information is on issues that have to do with how policy is decided. And so I'm wondering if you could, in keeping in mind the reviewers' comments, but also thinking about the argument that you want to make, talk about the importance of government policy in how the dynamic for wealth accumulation and for inequalities changes over time. Thinking particularly of the 20th century, which has the anomalous period in which inequity is decreasing, and ask you about how that policy formation takes place and what role you see as for understanding the policy history of what's going on there, in order to be able to understand how actual practice changes for for taxation in particular, but there are a number of other areas of government policy that play a role.
First of all, I don't view this period of declining inequality as anomalous. You know, I think there was particular circumstances that made this institutional response and policy response possible, but I'm not saying there's anything anomalous in this particular institutional response. And I think, generally speaking, probably the main conclusion of my book, which I state right in the introduction, is that the history of the distribution of income and wealth is very much a political and institutional history, and depends on the institution and the policies that different societies choose for themselves. And it's not a purely economic history, and I don't believe in economic deterministic laws. There are powerful economic forces going in different directions. Some can push toward a reduction in inequality, the diffusion of skills and knowledge and education goes in this direction. Some other forces push in the direction of rising inequality. This includes the high gap between rate of return and growth rate in the long run. But in the end, which force prevails really depends on the institution and policies that we choose. And so these choices of policy institutions sometimes depend on major shocks like World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, but it's always more complicated than this because the shocks themselves cannot be treated as purely exogenous, and one can argue that World War I itself was partly the product of the very high social tension that were in pre-World War I Europe, partly because of the very high inequality, and the rise toward nationalism was partly due to this high degree of domestic political tension. Also, I try to stress in the book that it's not only World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, it's also the Bolshevik Revolution, which played a huge role in putting pressures on the elite in developed Western countries so that they would accept fiscal and social reforms that they refused until 1914. So in particular, I focus a lot on the case of France, where in the early 1920s, these are political groups that were the Bloc National chamber, that was one of the most right-wing chambers in the French history, which adopted very progressive income taxation with 60% top tax rate on higher income brackets. And these are the same people who refused the 2% income tax in 1914. And so what happened, it's more than the war. Between 1914 and 1920, the Bolshevik Revolution completely changed the political intellectual landscape, because many people in the West thought, well, after all, it's better to pay high tax than to be expropriated. And certainly after World War II and the victory jointly with the Soviet Union over fascism, the entire political and intellectual landscape about the role of government had been transformed. So I don't view this as an anomalous period. It's a product of extreme political shocks, but these political shocks themselves are to a large extent endogenous to the development process and the inequality process. So in the same way, the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of more laissez-faire policy after Reagan and Thatcher, I try to analyze this as a process that's partly endogenous. In particular, I try to show in my book, probably not enough, but I try to show that national identities matter a lot. So different countries need to always try to tell to themselves historical narrative about why they have a good growth performance, whether they have high inequality, low inequality. So they try to describe themselves in comparison to other countries. And in the Thatcher-Reagan revolution, I think a lot can be analyzed as a product of the comparison that was made with in the 70s with Germany and Japan, or even France or Italy, that were catching up with Britain and the US, and this played a big role in this revolution. So these are collective beliefs systems that are involved, and that's what I try to show in my book, is that we need to analyze this process of belief transformation and political perceptions of the economy and of inequality in order to understand institutional and policy change. And to summarize, if we want to put institutions at the center of economic analysis, I think we also need to put distribution inequality and beliefs about distribution inequality at the center of economic analysis.
Yeah, and certainly your book, clearly from the way you talk about the issue in the book, that you want debate to be generated. Your book is generating a lot of that debate. But to come back to the period of the two world wars and the role of government policies and perceptions, if one were to disentangle the different elements that are involved in the destruction of wealth that goes on and the reduction of inequalities, could not one argue that a combination of the kind of physical destruction that takes place, and in particular the inflation that takes place after the First World War and again after the Second World War, are really critical factors, and that it's the government inability to deal with inflation rather than government decisions, or the decisions they make in trying to deal with the problem of inflation, that is one of the real contributing factors. And if governments now have inflation under really tight control, is the same kind of reduction in inequality much less likely?
You're right. Physical destruction and inflation are key components of why you have this big reduction in private wealth to national income ratio between 1914 and 1945. But this process also involves other policies as well, like rent control policy contributed a lot to the reduction of the market value of real estate. So that doesn't mean that there's less real estate, there's a lower quantity of capital, but certainly the market value and the value of assets for their owners is diminished. Nationalization policy also played a large role. So there's a progressive taxation, in particular of dividend distribution. In some cases, makes it, you are the owner of the firm, but you are not being nationalized, but you cannot really distribute dividend to yourself unless you accept to pay sometimes 80-90% tax rate. If you combine the progressive tax and the corporate tax in the post-war years. So it's really this entire combination of policies and not only inflation, although inflation in some countries is certainly one of the major actors through the huge reduction in public debt in particular, but it's really more generally this combination of policy and institutional response that lead to this very large reduction in effect, the power of private capital and the relative importance of private wealth in the post-war society.
Yeah. Okay, I do want to come back to the question of war and government and how that changes what is happening in the economy, but I want to stay with a couple of other points that come up in the reviews first. So the next thing I'd like to ask you about is the interest that a couple of the reviewers had in understanding better about wage inequality. And so this was brought up both by Richard Keisel and by Mary Ferner, about that they found your recounting of what happens with wages and wage inequality for the United States and for France to not have the kind of depth that they would have liked. And I'm wondering if you had any response about the wage issues that they raise.
I think there are many limitations in this book, and one of the important limitations is probably indeed that I don't analyze the wage formation and wage inequality process in as much depth as the dynamics of concentration of property and concentration of wealth, and so that's certainly one of the important limitations. In particular, I devote far too much space to the issue of unions and collective bargaining. I talked a little bit about unions, about the role of collective bargaining, the role of salary scales, the role of minimum wages, in particular in chapter 8, but that's too short, that's too brief as compared to the overall importance of the issue. And I very much agree that I try to show that the dynamics of wage inequality always involve a large number of specific institutions and social compromise and salary scale. And of course, the educational system with supply and demand of skill play a key role. Corporate governance issue for the formation of very top managerial pay plays a key role. I try to describe these different forces, but I certainly do not analyze them, as fully as one should. I try to cover, 3 centuries and several dozen countries. So even though it's a big book, it's cannot be enough to cover everything. So, in my view, it's more an introduction to study of capital and inequality in historical perspective.
An introduction, and I read it also as an inspiration for further areas for research where people aren't satisfied with either the nature of the arguments or the presence of arguments, that it's an opportunity for further research, which is something I'll come back to as well in a moment. Another comment that was made by a couple of the reviewers has to do with your underlying economic theories being basically neoclassical rather than classical theory that attaches more importance to value created by labor. And I'm wondering if you had any comment.
I disagree with this idea that my theory is too neoclassical. I think the theoretical framework that I use is a combination. I try to combine different approaches. In particular, let me say very clearly that I do not believe that the standard neoclassical model of capital accumulation with one good and no other issue. And I don't believe that this is a proper model to describe capital accumulation in any country or in any society. And I try to make clear in the book that what I believe in is a multidimensional approach to capital and wealth. So when you do this big addition and you sum up the market values of all assets, from real estate to financial assets to business assets, I try to make clear in the book that this is a very abstract kind of operation. This is useful for some purposes. This allows to compare the aggregate value of wealth in different societies that are otherwise impossible to compare. But this is certainly not sufficient to well understand, all the complicated multidimensional property relation and social relations between owners of capital and workers. And I try to make very clear in my book, when I talk about real estate and the relation between owners and tenants, particular institutions when control play a role. When I talk about slave capital in the southern United States before 1865, clearly this is a very extreme form of power relation and social relations that goes with property relation. When I talk about foreign investment and I analyze all the political tensions that come with this kind of international inequality dimension. When I talk about the difference between the stock market value and the book value of companies, for instance in Germany, I make very clear that the market value of capital and the social value of capital can be two very different concepts. So in the German model, you have relatively less power for shareholders and a bit more power for workers, representatives, and sometimes regional government. So this reduces the market value of companies, but this is certainly not a bad thing in itself, and apparently this does not prevent them from producing good cars. And so I try to make clear. So I think bargaining power and power relations between groups are a very big part of the history of capitals that I try to describe. And I want to make clear that the neoclassical model is is forgetting all of this, and that's more than a limitation. It means that it's not impossible to understand the history of capital and inequality simply by using this model. And this is why my book is so long. If I just believe that we can make the addition and treat capital as an homogeneous concept, then the book would be much shorter.
Yeah, well, I think that anyone who reads it with care will find areas in which they want more explanation or in which they might disagree with particular analyses that you have. But I don't think very many of us, in feeling that as we read through, are thinking when we get to the end of the book, well, this book needs another 300 or 400 pages to really do this right. So the book accomplishes a lot and has a tremendous amount of research there, and I think that the four reviewers recognize that. It also opens the possibility to stimulate lots of new research, and that's what I wanted to move to in the latter part of our discussion here. And that's the importance of historical research and the role that it plays. And my first question for you about that is something that I'm hoping that your interactions with people since the book has come out, so that the historical research that is fundamental to your analysis, and how that reaches people who are making decisions is something that you might be able to comment about. What role does historical research actually play in informing public discussion and policy decisions?
That's a very complicated question. I believe in the...
It's probably too early to know as well.
I believe in the power of books and the power of ideas, but of course, we have to be modest. I think everybody is influencing the formation of belief in its own ways, and ultimately, as I say, the history of inequality and the future of inequality will depend on these perceptions and the way people feel about the economy. And I think historical research can play a major role in influencing the historical narrative, including the popular narratives that people believe in about the economy. I think the books about economic history had a big impact in the past. If you think of the book by Milton Friedman on the monetary history of the United States, it was clearly a sort of a new reading of the history of the big part of the 20th century, in particular a reading of the history of the Great Depression, with a very powerful political message, which was basically saying all what we need is a good Federal Reserve Bank. We don't need the welfare state, we don't need progressive taxation, that's not useful. All we need is a good Federal Reserve that does not let the financial system go entirely bankrupt. And if we have this, then we are fine. And so I'm simplifying, of course, a little bit the big political message, but this had, I think, a very powerful influence. And this is, of course, a very important piece of historical research. Although at the end, I certainly disagree with Milton Friedman, and I believe that we need, on the top of a good Federal Reserve, we also need a good welfare state and a good progressive tax system and other institutions as well. But so I think this, people need historical narrative on how to interpret what went wrong and what went well in the history of their country, in their own little micro-level economic history. And I think historical research can contribute to the formation and the transformation of dominant public opinion about this. And ultimately, this is, I think, much more important than talking to politicians or direct discussion with policymakers, which in many cases policymakers and politicians are just doing what they feel the dominant public opinion is waiting for them. And so I think that's why it's important that books reach a broad public, because I think ultimately this is a lot more important.
And clearly there's some part of that political class which goes to history to look for arguments to sustain policies that they've already decided. They don't go to look for, to inform themselves in order to think through something. That there's a instrumentalization often of history at a fairly superficial
sometimes
level.
they can change their mind. Sometimes, I'm not saying they are.
Yeah, I'm not saying that's true of everyone, but
yeah, they are like normal citizens, so they can change their mind on the basis of new evidence. But to a large extent, what they're doing, what their job is to try to guess what people are ready to accept or what people are waiting for. So they're trying to guess about the dominant public opinion more than about their own opinion, which, given their job is maybe is a reasonable thing to do. But anyway, that's the beauty of democracy, that we care about the opinion of everybody and not just the opinion of the political leaders.
let me come back to, because you mentioned the welfare state a couple of times. In saying that, I wanted to come back to the period of the two world wars. The term welfare state can generate a knee-jerk reaction that it's sort of giving handouts to people who are lazy and undeserving. But another way of conceptualizing the way that the role of the state changed in the period from 1914 through to 1950s, 60s, 70s, is a couple of historians have talked about it as being not a welfare state, but a warfare state, in which spending related to warfare has been a way not only of bringing a huge increase in the role of the state in the economy and the amount of spending that it does, but also in terms of the way in which it drew on popular support for changes that are being made. So that there's been 2 books called Warfare State come out in the last 10 years, one on the United States by James Sparrow in 2011, one by David Edgerton on Britain in 2006, I believe. And given the period that you have in which there are declining inequalities in the 20th century is linked very much to the wars and to state policies. Is the warfare state one way of perhaps reformulating it in a way that might better represent the changes taking place, how that period was exceptional?
I certainly agree that the wars play a major role in the rise of the modern welfare state and the decline in inequality. And one of the important findings of my historical research is that until World War I, until 1914, there was very little tendency toward reduction of inequality. If anything, there was rising concentration of wealth in the countries for which we have the best data on wealth, like France, and also the size of government was not rising very fast or not rising at all, and there was a strong resistance of the elite to the kind of social reforms and fiscal reform which were finally accepted after World War I and even more so after World War II. So, and in the first stages of expansion of the role of government, indeed directly related to war spendings were very important. At the same time, I think it will be a bit reductionist view to sort of summarize everything with war, because in some countries, war were not necessarily the key driving force, like in Sweden, the rise of the social state and the social democrats was more electoral and directly induced by the war, although the general attitudes towards the working of the market economy were of course influenced by the disasters due to the war and to the Great Depression. So it's I think at some level it's impossible to disentangle really the different forces itself. And as I said before, World War I itself can be viewed to some extent as a consequence of extreme inequality in Europe at that time and extreme competition between the capitalists of the different countries in order to, in particular, to invest their capital in the colonies and in foreign countries and to own a bigger part of the pie and of the rest of the world. So the distributional conflict, both at the domestic level and at the international level, was a part of the process that led to the war itself. So, and war will always be part of the big history of wealth redistribution. It played a big role. The war in Iraq, the first war in Iraq was about the redistribution of oil to Kuwait, and so it will, war will always play a role as one of the political processes that lead to regulation of inequality and redistribution of wealth, but it cannot be isolated from the other set of institutions and policy responses, less violent and in the end more effective and more sustainable, and that can contribute to a better institutional response and less extreme inequality.
Yeah. Let me ask you about something else. A phrase that is coming up more often now is inclusive capitalism. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, there was a conference on inclusive capitalism in London back last May that Mark Carney spoke at about the role for central banks in creating a more inclusive system and a new social contract. There was reference made to inclusive capitalism in some of the coverage of President Obama's State of the Union address last week. I'm wondering how inequalities and the changing dynamics of inequalities contribute to whether you have an inclusive or an exclusive system.
I also use sometimes the word inclusive capitalism or inclusive institution, and I think they are a useful concept. And the risk is that maybe it's a bit too broad and too vague sometimes. So that's a problem. We need to put content, because if we just talk about inclusive institution versus extractive institution, as some other people would say, this is useful only up to a certain point. If it's too vague and too general, so I think in particular it's important to recognize the role that can play, social investment in education on the one hand, progressive taxation on the other hand, other forms of regulation of property relation, finally, worker involvement in companies and different ways of limiting the power of owners, and to bring more democratic governance of capital, which will play a role in the future. If you look at the evolution of media organization or university organization, the idea that we can organize everything through shareholder company with full power to shareholders, I think is just ideological and wrong, and there will be other forms of property arrangements that will develop in the future. So education, progressive taxation, new forms of property regulation, all of this will play a role, and I think sometimes this new concept of inclusive capitalism, sometimes maybe put too much emphasis of what we refer to as pre-distribution, which is, of course, it's very important to try to reduce endowments in skills, endowments in capital, rather than just redistributing afterwards. But I think the frontier between pre-distribution and redistribution is not sometimes so clear, and we need, progressive taxation of inheritance and wealth can contribute to a better pre-distribution of endowments and resources and capital, and also can make it difficult for extreme inequality of labor earnings in particular to develop at the very top end. And so, in effect, progressive taxation has also an impact on pre-tax distribution of wealth and labor earnings. So some of these words sometimes tend to obscure, the frontiers, and to create a division between different types of policies, which I think are not always justified.
Yeah, and one of the things I found interesting in what I've read about inclusive capitalism in relation to your book is the idea about how important education is, and the ways in which inequalities in wealth mean that equality of opportunity doesn't really exist when there are extreme inequalities, because your quality of opportunity has a lot to do with the kind of endowments that you bring to the...
Right. So there's a lot of hypocrisy, I think, about inequality of opportunity and about meritocracy in general. And at some point in the book, I give a simple statistic about the average income of the parents of Harvard University students, which from the best data sources we have right now seems to be equivalent to the average income of the top 2% of the US distribution of family income. So of course you have students who come from below the top 2, but they are sufficiently few, and the students coming from the top 2 are sufficiently high within the top 2 that the overall average is as if the students had been picked at random within the top 2. And some of these come from very high tuition fees, some of these sometimes come from the fact that you can make gift in order to basically pay the admission of your children. And the gap between the official discourse based on meritocracy and the hyper-mobility of the US society and the reality of the number, I think is quite frightening. And I think we need a lot more transparency on these issues. All these admission procedures, it's very difficult to look at them, to study them, because the institutions that do that, they don't want other people to study this, and I think it's a big problem.
Yeah, and it's a problem in which actually getting good information takes time, and even if someone else has gathered it, so that actually having people well informed about what's happening is a challenge in itself. Let me, because I know we're running short on time, let me take a phrase from Mary Ferner's review saying citizens need to know, and ask you as a final question, what would you emphasize that citizens need to know from your book in terms of the relationship between inequality and increasing inequality and economic growth and economic stability. Is there some?
Yeah, well, maybe one of the findings is that extreme inequality is not only is not useful for growth, but can have negative impact on growth and stability. Extreme inequality first can lead to very high perpetuation of inequality over time, a lack of mobility, and that's not good for growth. It often also comes together with high instability for the macroeconomy, because when you have such a large share of total growth going to a small group of the population, probably this contributed, in particular in the US, to not only to the stagnation of median household incomes until 2008, but also to the rise of household debt, and in the end this contributed to fragilize the US financial system. And finally, extreme inequality can be a real danger for our democratic institutions, and if you have too much influence of private money into politics, in effect, this is really threatening our democratic ideal in a very strong manner. So this is not saying that we want complete equality, because there is some level of inequality that can be justified by growth considerations, but we need strong democratic institutions and fiscal institutions and educational institutions, and in order to ensure that these powerful market forces will work in the common interest and will deliver a level of inequality that can be justified by incentive and growth consideration, and not extreme inequality. And for this to happen, transparency and access to information is absolutely critical, so that we can adapt our policies, and in particular our tax rate on income and wealth and property and inheritance, to the underlying evolution. Otherwise, it's extremely difficult to have an informed and reasonable democratic conversation about inequality and taxation.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's great to have a small portion of your time, and thank you, and good luck with the book. And I hope that, as clearly as part of the impulse of the book, generating public debate and generating informed public debate has been happening. It will continue, and I hope that you are fully engaged and enjoy the outcomes.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for this discussion.
Okay.